Everyone, today we're going to be covering the content providers. So for this one, you're going to download the content provider contacts example. This is going to contain the following files. You're going to have a main activity. It's going to have some boilerplate code that we're going to fill in. Then you're going to have three XML files. You're going to have the strings XML, and we're going to have the query 4 XML and the query 1 XML. We're gonna see what they're gonna be doing, but for now, just know that that's what we're gonna be using. In the main file, what we're gonna be doing with this example is we're gonna go and look up our contacts in our phone, and then we're gonna query them using a content provider to show or to retrieve different information based on different criteria. For this one, the first thing that you need to do is give the app that you're working on permissions to actually read the already defined database with the contact information. So for this one, the first step is to go to your Android manifest and enter the permission for the read contacts. Then remember that when we were going through and getting the permission for the text messages, there was necessary for us to ask permission to the user directly. This is due to the changes in security on Android that happened in version 6.0, effectively making it so the XML permission statement is not enough for your app to have permission to access some features of your phone. So for that one, we also have to come into the code and make a call to the request permission method. Now, the first thing you want to do is check if your own application has the permissions to do what you want to do. So we do that by using the method check self permission, and we want to check the permission that is on the manifest, and it is read contacts. Now we compare if that permission has been granted by the package manager. If it has not been granted, then that means that you don't have permissions, so you will have to request the permissions. This will receive a nice array of permissions. We only need one, so we're just gonna be passing in one element to this array. And then we need a permission code. So request with contacts. This has to be an integer. It can be any number between larger than 0. This is going to be used as the key that you're going to use when the result is retrieved, whether the permission was given or not, to provide feedback to the user. So this is going to be 100 in our case. This is going to be just one variable, so no matter if it's in different instances, we can make it static and final. And in here, we have to use the check self permission. This is lowercase method. If the permission is granted, then we're gonna go into the else statement. So what we're gonna be doing in the else statement is executing the different queries and updating our UI. Now, the request permissions method is another method that you will have to override in order to give some feedback to the user. The way it is, usually you will not get any feedback to whether the user gave the permissions or not. It will just be like static in the sense that your app will not react to it. So what we're gonna do is override the method so that we have some degree of feedback to the user. So let's just look for on request permission result. Perfect. And here we're just gonna be saying that if, first of all, let's check if the code that we're getting, so we're getting the request code, that will match the code that we sent as part of the request permissions. So if that code is the same as this, that means this is the result for that permissions. Then we check if the permission was granted. We check that by looking at the grant results variable. So we only ask for one permission, so we just check the position 0. We check if the permission was granted. If it was, let's just print a message to the log, discover perms with the key, and permission granted for contacts. Now this is on the log, this is not for the user, but if the user did not give permission to the app to access it, then we probably want to tell them that we cannot do anything without that permission. So we can say until you grant permission, we cannot display contacts. Okay. The length of the toast is gonna be short, and don't forget to call show. Now, what will happen here is that you will come to this point, and this is where the method will be automatically called by Android just upon the response. So effectively here is where you are brought up to the screen that asks the user whether they want to grant permissions or not. After that screen is finished, this method will be called automatically. So let's go back once again. Then on the else, we're gonna have the query. So for now, let's just go ahead and grant the permissions. Now in my case, since I already have a version of the app, the permissions will be granted. So what I'm gonna do is uninstall the app first. Completely. Then I can start running the code. This will build the app and install it in the phone. As you can see, the first thing that will get thrown up is in the request permissions. So if we deny, we're gonna get, until you get permissions, we cannot display anything. And if we start the app once again, it's gonna ask us once again if we want to provide permissions. We're gonna allow. Read contacts. I checked the wrong number. This code and results. Yeah. And results. And the permissions match. First it contacts and results equals 0. And the permission is granted. People log. Now the permission wasn't granted this time. It's from the app. Then we start it, so I have to do it manually once again. Okay, now we have the permissions have been granted. We have to make sure that we did. Granted contacts Welcome to the statement. We're just gonna run that once again. Uninstall. Yeah, it's installing the app once again from zero. And go to Logcat. Service application. Edit filters. Filter one. Turns. Yeah, permission has been granted for the contacts. Yeah, that's when I wanted to double check. Oh, here. This is why it was printed. I forgot to put the else there. That's why it showed there that it wasn't granted, but it had been granted. Okay, so now we have permissions to actually look at the data on the contacts. We're gonna start doing that. So the first query that we're gonna be doing is just a plain selection, select everything from the contacts. And the first thing that we need is a cursor. This is effectively what is gonna store the results of the query. So we're gonna get the content resolver. We're gonna say issue a query. Then the query has several parameters. The first one is the table that you want to query. Now in this case, we're gonna do the contacts table, and we need to get the URI. So this is the universal resource identifier of the table we want to query. Then we don't have any of the other parameters. We do not have a projection, a selection, arguments, or a sorting criteria. So we just leave them null. Then we are using a list activity in this case. So we don't need to use a XML layout. All we need to do is provide an adapter for the data that we want to show. So in this case, since we're dealing with cursor data, we're gonna be using a semicolon there. We're gonna be using the list columns. This is gonna effectively say which columns of your data stored in the cursor you want to show. Now we're gonna say this is a string, and here we want to say that we want to have the ID. So this is the part that we want to show. We only want to show the ID column. Now this is going to be the rows that we're going to be using and the elements that we're going to be using to render this information. So we're going to be putting it into the contact name, and then we're going to use a cursor adapter to actually convert the data of the cursor into a UI representation that we can use. So the first thing we need is a context, then we need the layout that we're going to use for each element, then we need the data itself, then we need the columns that we want to put in, and then we need the IDs that we want to put it into, and then we need also a flag that determines how this is going to be updated. Now let's use the flag register content observer and execute our application. No, it's not done yet. We still have to set the adapter. So I'll set the list adapter to be and cursor adapter. Okay. Until we can do that, then it is not going to be linked to the UI. It's just gonna stay in memory. Once we set this list adapter, it's gonna use those properties to iterate through the data and show the data into the list. So as you can see, we have 5 different contacts. In your case, you probably don't have any contacts on your phone or in your emulator phone, so it will be an empty one. So make sure to go here to contacts and modify adding different contacts. Make sure that you have at least one contact or 2 contacts that don't have a phone number. We're gonna be using that later on in our queries. So this one doesn't have a phone number, so just create an empty contact with a name. Now here, this is a select all, so that means we can use the values from any column in this table. So we can use the display name. We can show it there. We can also use the status label, primary customer income, lookup key, photo, URI, print. Most of these are going to be empty, but we can access them. So let's go with one that we can access. Let's try status label. Now this is the name, and then let's run it once again with the status label. Yeah, it's just an empty string, but we can access that data. Okay, now that was the first example. Now we're gonna move on to the second query. It's gonna be very similar, so we're just gonna copy most of it here. The thing is that right now we're gonna have a selection, so we're gonna select only the ID and the name columns. So this is a projection, which means that you're gonna just take on in the data those particular columns. So what you need to do is just a list with the names of the columns that you want to keep in your cursor. So we're just gonna keep the ID and the name. Perfect. And then here we change the projection from that to this one. And that's it. Let's go ahead and change our query that we're executing and execute the code. As you can see, there's no difference in what the UI looks like at the moment. That's because this change that we did in query number 2 will be reflected in the columns that we can use in the mlist columns. So remember that before we tried to access the contact status label and it returned some empty values. Now if we try to do that in this new query, in this new cursor, you're gonna find out, give it a second, that the app crashes. So if we go here to run, we'll see there's an exception. Effectively what it tells you is that the column doesn't exist. That's because we don't have it in the cursor because of the projection we used, only selects the data from these 2 columns. Now why do we do that? Because when you have large tables, it's not resource efficient to be loading all of that data into memory into a cursor, so you will only select the data that you want using a projection. Now we're gonna move along to query number 3. Query number 3 is gonna be a different query where we have, in addition to a projection, we're gonna have a selection clause. So what is a selection clause? If you're familiar with queries in SQL, it's gonna be very similar. It's where you put things like where, conditions for your data, and this is going to be different. So what you will have to do is just effectively write the conditions that you want to enforce. So in this case, we have that the contact dot has phone number value will equal 1. Now we could hard code it to be a 1 here, but if we want that value to be something that can be set programmatically either by the user entering some input or by your code making some selection, then you will want to use the selection arguments. This is going to be an array of strings that will be used to fill up the gaps or the question marks inside of your selection clause. So we put a 1 here. The content resolver, when issuing the query, will look at the selection clause, see that there's a question mark, and replace it with the first element of the selection arguments. Now, since we're having a selection here, if we try to do this right now, we will get the error that it doesn't exist. So we're just gonna have to add that column to our projection. Now, after that, we just change here to be the selection clause and the selection arguments. We don't need to change any of the rest of the code. Now this query effectively says only display the elements or the contacts that we have that have a phone number attribute. It's not looking whether the number is 1, it's looking whether they have a phone number. Let's go once again. Installing. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's go to our contacts. Contacts. Can you give me the contacts? Yeah. So we have 3, 4, 5. Now this one has phone number 1. So let's edit this one. Let's remove the phone number. Save. Then let's go back to our application. And I forgot to change this. And now we're executing query 2 again. Let's run it once again. Now we're going to be using query number 3. And as we can see, only 2 contacts are shown. This is because only 2 of the contacts in our contact list actually have a number, or a phone number. Now, that is it for query number 3. Now, query number 4 is going to be a more complex version of query number 3. Now, in this case, we're going to have a second clause. This is just for demonstration purposes because the column that we're going to be using, the times contacted, is already deprecated, so it's not going to have any value for us on our emulator. So we're just going to go ahead and add it to our projection. And then, similar to how you will do it in a SQL query, you're going to say if this condition and you add the second condition. Let's just put it down here. to close the second selection clause, and in this case it will be a 5. Now if the contact has been contacted more than 5 times, then they will be displayed. Now here we're gonna be leaving it as is just for now to show you what will happen. Then we're gonna make a second change to make it a little bit more obvious what's happening. So right now, as you can see, it's empty. Knowing that there's empty thing doesn't tell us much. So there's 2 because I did not change the query. And 4, perfect. The query, syntax server, select the ID, display, phone number. Okay, let's see what did I enter wrong. So it's the selection clause. There's an invalid query. So, okay, I need to put a space here. Just because this will concatenate, right now it's looking at the table and contacts contact. So, that should fix it. When you're dealing with selection clause, you have to be very careful with the spaces. Okay, so as you can see, this one is empty. Nothing has been contacted more than 5 times, just because Aviar emulator doesn't have that value, and because it's deprecated, it's only still kept on the table, but it's no longer being used by the applications. So unless you're working on a real phone, that value is more likely to be a 0 than not. It's a deprecated value. Contacted, first phone number. And the display name. I'm trying to force the emulator by comparing to lower numbers, but it's no longer supported, so it's probably going to be a really small random number. Okay, so we're gonna move on into making a small change here. So right now we have more than one piece of data here, and we would like to show it to the user. So what we're gonna say is that we're gonna pass into the cursor adapter 2 columns. It's gonna be the display name and the ID, and it's gonna be mapped to the contact name and the ID number fields. Now this refers to this XML. We have 2 text views. One text view is called ID number, and the other one is called contact name. Now this is the same name that we used here, but they are independent resource layouts. So now we're gonna be using this one, and we're gonna change the selection clause to be the simple one. And then leave this empty, and let's run it again, and we'll see what happens now. What we're effectively doing is changing the layout resource that is being used to render each element. So as you can see, we use the values from the distinct elements to show them into the screen. Now if we put this to 0, then we will get a list of all of the contacts that do not have a phone number. And there we go. Now the last query that we're gonna be looking at is a display order. So for this one, we're just gonna be using a simplified version of query number 4. Or let's use query number 4. Effectively, the only difference is that we pass an order in here. And what is the order that you will put here? That is effectively just the column that you want to order your data. So in this case, we're gonna order them by display name. Now, if you remember, up to this point, they've always been sorted by the ID. If you notice, when we printed the ID, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the order that's been used to sort their elements or their contacts in our app. Right now, we want to sort them alphabetically by the name of the contact. So we're just going to be doing that. Popper, Doggo, Kato right now is ordered by the ID 345. Ordered by. Did I change the query? Yeah. I'm sure that I run the right one. I think I might have pressed run before I made the change of the query. Okay, now it's ordered CDP. Now it just so happens that the order of this is different, but we can change or validate whether we're doing is fine by just adding a new contact. So let's go ahead and do that. So this contact will have an ID of 6, because it's the 6th contact that we're adding, and this is going to be an elephant. Now why elephant? Because that way I will force it to be printed between the E and the P that we had before. Let's go back to our app. Now as you can see, this one is not updated yet. So if you want your app to update regularly, whenever something changes, you can do that by changing the cursor adapter flag to flag auto requery. Now this is not the most efficient way to do it. You will get into a lot of performance issues if you do it when dealing with a large amounts of data, but it is the simplest way, especially when you're dealing with a very small amount of data. Okay, now we have this, and then the change that we did with the query that we did is going to be reflected after we go back. The emulator is not copying. Okay, there we go. Let's add a new one. BRD. Save. Wait. BRD has been saved. And let's go back to our app. Let's save the contacts once again. Now as you can see, the data was refreshed automatically, and we have Birdie over here. So that is it for the content provider. Thank you.